This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are looking at an excerpt from a text titled "What Was Scientific Socialism?" And we're going to fundamentally unpack a massive historical misunderstanding of just a single word.
Just one word.
Yeah.
Right.
But it is a misunderstanding that actually changes how we view history. It changes how we analyze political theory and how we understand the way ideas shape the entire world around us. Because we know you want to gain this knowledge quickly and thoroughly, without feeling totally overwhelmed by dense academic jargon.
Exactly. We're taking the core arguments from this source material, and we're mapping out the architecture of a very specific, highly influential thought process.
And before we get going, we need to do a quick bit of housekeeping.
Right, the disclaimer. Because our source material inherently touches on some really politically charged concepts, specifically the historical development of socialism, capitalism, and the analytical framework of Karl Marx. We need to establish a clear baseline for you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
This deep dive will remain strictly impartial. We are absolutely not taking sides here. We're not endorsing any political viewpoints, whether that's left-wing or right-wing.
We're definitely not here to litigate the ultimate moral rights or wrongs of Marxist political theory.
Right. Our goal today, which mirrors the source text itself, is simply to analyze the philosophical methodology and the historical context that's contained within the original writing.
Okay, let's unpack this. What if the word scientific in 19th century Germany meant something fundamentally different than what we assume it means today?
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around at first.
It really is, because that is the core mystery our source text presents. When modern readers encounter the phrase scientific socialism, we immediately bring our current linguistic baggage to that first word.
We do. We absolutely do. And it creates this immediate barrier to understanding the text's actual intent. I mean, if you ask an English speaker or, say, a Japanese speaker today what the word scientific implies, the immediate association is empirical validation.
Right, you think of chemistry labs.
Yes. You think of hypotheses being relentlessly tested against physical reality, observable phenomena, hard data.
People in white lab coats measuring things.
Exactly. We think of the scientific method as an iterative process of proving or disproving theories based on tangible evidence. That is our modern baseline.
But the source text clarifies that in the context of 19th century German academia, the word they used, which was Wissenschaftlich, did not carry that mandate for empirical physical experimentation at all.
No, not at all. It had a completely different methodological flavor.
So what did it actually mean then?
Well, to be Wissenschaftlich in that specific era and that academic culture, it wasn't about isolating variables in a laboratory. Instead, it meant adhering to a highly specific, rigorous, scholarly format.
A format.
Right. It meant that your theoretical work was comprehensive, it was deeply conceptual, and above all, it was structurally and logically watertight. It was about creating a self-contained framework where every single component naturally derived from the initial premise.
I think the best way to visualize this difference is to think of a beautifully organized spreadsheet.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Or even the inner workings of a perfectly structured fantasy novel universe.
Yes, like where all the magic rules perfectly align and make sense.
Exactly. Or think of a complex geometric proof. If your initial axioms are sound and your logical steps are flawless, the conclusion is absolutely true within that system. It doesn't require you to go out into the physical world and, physically measure a real triangle to prove that the interior angles add up to 180 degrees.
Because the logic just validates itself.
Right. The logic validates itself. Being Wissenschaftlich was about explaining the world not as a scattered, chaotic pile of random chronological events, but as one beautifully unified, coherent system.
What's fascinating here is how this entirely shifts our understanding of the historical text's original claim. When the framework of scientific socialism was being articulated, its authors were not claiming to have discovered a physics equation for human behavior.
They weren't claiming to have physical lab data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were claiming the ultimate intellectual high ground of their particular era, which was structural methodological perfection. They were asserting that they had developed a perfectly logical, systematic way to view the totality of human society.
Which brings us to the philosopher who really pioneered this Wissenschaftlich approach to analyzing human existence.
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Yes, Hegel. Our source material points to Hegel as the foundational architect of this specific way of thinking, particularly when it came to the philosophy of history.
Hegel is the crucial prerequisite here. To understand the framework Marx later built, we first have to understand Hegel's view of history, at least as it's outlined in our text.
Because before Hegel, history was viewed pretty differently, right?
Yeah, prior to this kind of philosophical intervention, history was often viewed simply as a chronicle of events. A king dies, a war is fought, a famine occurs. It just looks like a chaotic, largely random series of accidents and coincidences.
Just stuff happening.
Right, just stuff happening one after another. But Hegel completely rejected that interpretation. He argued that history is actually the continuous unfolding development of human reason.
He essentially proposed that history has a directional engine. He didn't see a random sequence of events, he saw a mechanism. And the text breaks down Hegel's historical template really clearly. He argued that every historical stage of human society contains what he called internal contradictions.
Let's pause and define that, because internal contradiction is a term that gets thrown around a lot without much mechanical explanation.
Yeah, it sounds like academic jargon.
It does. In the Hegelian sense, an internal contradiction means that the very structures that hold a society together simultaneously generate the friction that will eventually tear it apart.
Okay, so the society functions, but there is a fundamental philosophical or social tension woven right into its fabric. So society exists in a certain paradigm, but that inherent friction is constantly building pressure. Eventually, those internal contradictions bubble to the surface, they cause conflict, and they inevitably force society to give birth to a new reality.
And that new reality becomes the next stage of history.
And then it just keeps going.
Right. Once that new stage is established, it inevitably develops its own set of internal contradictions, which builds new pressure, leading to the subsequent stage, and the process repeats. It is an incredibly elegant, perpetual motion machine for human progress. It takes the sheer, overwhelming chaos of the human story and organizes it into a neat, predictable staircase.
I mean, you can see why that is intellectually deeply satisfying. When you look at history through that template, you aren't just memorizing dates. You are seeing the underlying code of human development.
Yes.
It tells you that there is a reason for the friction in the world, and that the friction isn't just meaningless suffering. It is actively driving humanity forward toward a higher state of rationality.
It is the ultimate Wissenschaftlich system. It is comprehensive, it is logically consistent, and it attempts to explain the totality of human progress through a single methodological lens.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because along comes Karl Marx. Marx studies Hegel's meticulously organized historical engine, and he adopts the structural methodology, but he makes one massive, world-altering adjustment to the machinery itself.
Right. Marx takes the Hegelian staircase, but he completely changes the material it is built from. For Hegel, the engine of history, the thing actually generating these contradictions and driving the progression, was the human spirit or the collective mind developing toward ultimate self-awareness.
It was fundamentally an idealism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Marx looked at that and argued that Hegel had the structure right, but the foundation backward. Marx replaced the abstract concept of spirit with the tangible reality of economics, specifically what he termed production relations.
Right, so instead of the evolution of ideas driving history, Marx argued it is the evolution of the economy driving history. Let's dig into what production relations actually means in the context of the source text.
It's a crucial term.
It is essentially asking, how does a society produce what it needs to survive? Who owns the tools and the land required for that production, and who is actually performing the physical labor?
That is the materialist flip. Marx argued that the way we organize our physical survival dictates our laws, our politics, and even our culture. And more importantly, he mapped Hegel's concept of internal contradictions directly onto these economic relationships.
So the source text lays out the specific historical progression that Marx constructed using this modified economic engine. Let's walk through how that mechanism supposedly functioned. It begins with feudalism.
Right.
Under feudalism, the production relations are based on land ownership by a nobility, and the labor is provided by serfs who are bound to that land.
But according to the theory, feudalism contains an internal contradiction. As trade expands and early industrial tools are developed, a new class of merchants and factory owners begins to emerge in the cities, the early bourgeoisie.
And the rigid land-based laws of feudalism restrict the economic growth of this new class.
Exactly. The mechanism is creating friction. The aristocratic structure is actively holding back the new industrial capacity.
That friction eventually boils over, often violently, as in the various European revolutions, and society is forced onto the next step of the staircase, which is capitalism. The old feudal restrictions are shattered, allowing for free trade, private ownership of industrial capital, and a massive explosion in production.
However, because this is a Wissenschaftlich system, the engine doesn't stop.
It keeps running.
It has to.
Yeah.
Capitalism, according to Marx's analysis, must inevitably develop its own fatal internal contradictions. And the source text notes that Marx spent the bulk of his life trying to meticulously map out these specific capitalist contradictions.
And the primary contradiction he identified was the dynamic between the people who own the factories and technology, the capitalists, and the people who sell their time to work in them, the proletariat.
The structural logic of the system demands that owners constantly seek to increase profit and efficiency,
Which inherently puts downward pressure on the wages and conditions of the workers who actually produce the value.
Marx theorized that this dynamic would inevitably concentrate wealth into fewer and fewer hands, while simultaneously expanding and organizing the working class. That is the internal contradiction building pressure.
Just like under feudalism.
Exactly the same mechanical process. And just as feudalism was forced to give way to capitalism, Marx argued that capitalism's internal friction must inevitably result in a crisis that gives birth to socialism.
Where the workers seize control of the production relations.
Right, which would then eventually resolve into a stateless, classless communism.
When you lay it out like that and you view it through the lens of 19th century German academia, it is crystal clear why this framework had such a profound and lasting impact. It is astonishingly Wissenschaftlich.
It's brilliant in its construction.
It really is. It is deeply structurally logical. It categorizes past historical eras with a highly functional analytical tool, and then it extends that exact same logic forward into the future. It reads like a grand narrative.
And that structural integrity is the source of its massive persuasive power. Because of that scholarly, organized format, the theory feels entirely deterministic. It reads far less like a localized political proposal and far more like the discovery of natural law governing human social development.
Like a law of physics for society.
Yes. It suggests that just as water inevitably boils when it reaches a certain temperature, society must inevitably transition to the next economic stage when the internal contradictions reach their breaking point.
I mean, if you present a reader with a highly logical sequence of past events that perfectly explains how society transitioned from the Middle Ages to the Industrial Revolution, and then you use that exact same mathematical-seeming logic to predict what will happen next century, people are going to place immense faith in that prediction. The format itself generates this powerful aura of certainty.
But this raises a profound methodological question, which is the core philosophical critique presented by our source material today. Does structural elegance equal empirical truth?
That is the big question.
Because a system is internally logical and because a theoretical framework is intellectually satisfying to its creator, does that actually guarantee it accurately represents the messy reality of the future?
So, what does this all mean? The text makes a critical distinction here that we really need to isolate. Being Wissenschaftlich, meaning your theory is comprehensive, systematic, and methodologically sound on paper, absolutely does not guarantee that your conclusions are actually true in practice.
Right. Having a tidy, watertight theoretical system is entirely distinct from possessing a definitive crystal ball of the future. The source text is careful to point out that hypothesizing about the future is a standard, necessary practice.
Sure, we do it all the time.
In modern economics, sociology, political science, researchers constantly build models to forecast potential future scenarios based on current structural data. That is just how we navigate complex societies.
But there is a very sharp methodological line that gets crossed here. When you take those theoretical models and you elevate them to the status of deterministic inevitability.
When you claim this exact sequence of events is absolutely guaranteed to happen because the internal logic of my system demands it.
Yes. When you do that, you are no longer operating within the bounds of rigorous analysis. You have crossed over into what the text describes as philosophical storytelling.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the core vulnerability identified in the text is that arrogant assumption of inevitability. Human history is not a perfectly engineered train track. It is not an inevitable automated progression driven solely by an elegant formula of economic friction and internal contradictions.
History is actually driven by countless unquantifiable variables. It is driven by individual human choices, by sudden technological breakthroughs that shatter existing models, by environmental shifts, and by sheer unpredictable random chance.
You cannot capture the totality of human behavior in a closed, logical loop, no matter how brilliant the architecture of that loop might be.
When you assume that human development operates like a geometric proof, you strip away human agency entirely. You assume that the complex web of global society will adhere perfectly to the rules you wrote in your manuscript.
Which means the future is never actually guaranteed, regardless of how flawless the theoretical math looks.
And that brings us to the really crucial takeaway for you, the listener, as we analyze this historical text. The primary danger discussed here isn't merely an academic debate about the precise timeline of Karl Marx's economic predictions.
No, focusing purely on that is missing the methodological forest for the trees.
The actual enduring danger lies in human psychology being seduced by the Wissenschaftlich format itself. When an argument is presented in a highly systematic, logical way, it gives us a false sense of certainty about the future.
That is the enduring lesson here. When any argument, whether it is formulated by a 19th century philosopher analyzing industrial capital or a 21st century technologist analyzing social behavior, is presented to us in a highly systematic, meticulously structured, and logically self-consistent way, it acts almost like an intellectual optical illusion.
It really does.
It grants us a deeply false sense of deterministic certainty about the future. We mistake the aesthetic beauty and the intellectual comfort of a closed system for the undeniable truth of the outcome.
Because we crave certainty. A chaotic, unpredictable world is terrifying, and a perfectly organized theoretical framework offers us a shield against that uncertainty.
To synthesize the main methodology critique from our source material today, scientific socialism was incubated within a very specific academic framework that idolized comprehensive, systematic inevitability. Its immense persuasive power over the last century and a half and its ultimate philosophical flaw lay fundamentally in its methodology.
It mistook a flawlessly organized, logical framework for a map of destiny.
Exactly. It assumed that because it could brilliantly and systematically diagnose the structural frictions of the past, it could flawlessly guarantee the exact shape of the future.
It is a brilliant, cautionary insight into how humans consume and trust complex information architectures. We are incredibly susceptible to systems that alleviate our anxiety about the unknown.
Very true.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds entirely on the methodological warning from our source text today.
I love this part.
The text warns us about the immense seductive power of systems that claim to definitively predict the future based on past structural data simply because their internal logic is flawlessly organized. Think about the informational ecosystem we rely on today. Think about the highly complex algorithms, the predictive AI models, and the massive data-driven forecasting engines we utilize every single day to tell us exactly how society will behave tomorrow.
It's everywhere.
Whether these systems are predicting global market fluctuations, the outcome of democratic elections, or just the subtle shifts in consumer behavior, we are surrounded by incredibly sophisticated, perfectly logical, mathematically structured systems.
The ultimate modern systems.
So are we still falling for the exact same intellectual illusion? Are we mistaking a beautifully organized, comprehensive system of data for the inevitable truth of the future, entirely forgetting that unpredictable human choices, unseen variables, and sheer random chance are still the forces that actually write the story?
It is a vital question to ask yourself every single time you are presented with a supposedly deterministic model of human behavior. The format may have evolved from 19th century philosophy to 21st century code, but the psychological temptation remains exactly the same.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it provided you with a robust new mental model for analyzing the theories and systems you encounter. Keep questioning the structural logic of the narratives around you, and as always, stay curious.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.